I never imagined that returning home would be so difficult. After 20 years serving my country, facing danger in distant lands, I thought I would be welcomed back with open arms. But the reality was quite different. My name is Marcus Johnson, I'm 45 years old, and I'm a veteran of the United States Army. I returned to my hometown in Texas a few weeks ago, still adjusting to civilian life. That Saturday afternoon, I decided to go to Joe's Diner, a restaurant I had frequented since I was a child. As soon as I walked in, I felt the stares. Maybe it was my military uniform, or maybe, I sat down at the counter and waited. And waited. The waiters passed me by as if I were invisible. After 15 minutes, I called out politely, "Excuse me, can I take my order?" The nearest waiter looked me up and down and replied dryly, "We're very busy right now. Why don't you try somewhere else?" I was shocked. I looked around and saw empty tables. Customers who arrived after me were already being served. That's when it hit me. They didn't want to serve me because of my skin color. At that moment, I felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and disappointment. I had fought for my country, risking my life to protect everyone's freedom, including the people who now treated me like a second-class citizen. I left the restaurant with my head held high, but inside I was shattered. How could this still happen in 2024? As I walked home, an idea began to form in my mind. I couldn't leave things like this. I had to do something, not just for myself, but for everyone who faces discrimination on a daily basis. Little did I know that my next action would change not only my life, but that of the entire community. I spent the rest of that day and the whole night thinking about what had happened. My military strategist mind couldn't switch off. I knew I needed to act, but I also knew I needed to be smart about it. The next morning, I called my old friend Mike, a local lawyer who was also a veteran. I told him what had happened and asked for his opinion. "Marcus, this is illegal and immoral," Mike said, the indignation evident in his voice. "We have to expose it, but we have to do it right." Together, we came up with a plan. We didn't just want to embarrass the restaurant. We wanted real, lasting change. We decided that I would go back to Joe's Diner, this time with a hidden camera. We would document everything and, depending on the outcome, decide on the next steps. But I wanted to go further. "Mike," I said, "what if we invited other veterans? Not just black people, but people of all races and backgrounds." Mike smiled. "Now you're thinking like a real leader, Marcus." Over the next few days, we discreetly contacted other veterans in the area. We explained the situation and asked for their help. The response was overwhelming. Dozens offered to take part. We set the date for the following Saturday. The plan was simple, but potentially powerful. We would go in small groups, spread throughout the day. Each group would have a mix of races, all wearing some indication of their military service: a beret, a unit jacket, a medal. The night before the operation, I gathered everyone together in my house. Looking at those faces, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, all united by a common purpose, I felt an emotion I hadn't experienced since my days in the Army. "Tomorrow," I said, "we don't just fight for ourselves. We fight for every person who has ever been discriminated against, for every child who deserves to grow up in a better world. We fight for the soul of our nation." As we dispersed, ready for the next day, I couldn't help wondering, how would Joe's Diner react when we all went together? What would happen when we faced prejudice not with anger, but with unity and dignity? Little did I know that the events of the following day would surpass all my expectations. Saturday dawned bright and sunny, as if the sky itself approved of our mission. At 10 a.m., our first group entered Joe's Diner. I watched from afar, my heart racing. The group consisted of John, a black veteran like me, Sarah, a white ex-pilot, and Miguel, a Hispanic ex-Marine. They sat and waited. And they waited, just like I did. Through the headset, I heard Sarah whisper, "They're completely ignoring us." My blood pressure rose, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was only the beginning. At noon, our second group came in. This time, there were 5 veterans, including an Asian American and a Native American. Again, they were ignored. The tension in the restaurant was palpable. Other customers began to notice, casting confused glances at the staff. At 2 p.m., it was my turn. I walked in with Mike and 3 other veterans. We walked straight up to the counter, our medals and insignia shining under the fluorescent lights. "Good afternoon," I said in a loud, clear voice. "We'd like to place our orders, please." The manager, a middle-aged man called Frank, approached with a nervous expression. "Look, we don't want any trouble here." "Trouble?" I replied calmly. "We just want to have lunch, like any other customer." At that moment, the other groups got up and joined us. Suddenly, half the restaurant was full of veterans of all colors and backgrounds. The silence that followed was deafening. Frank looked around, clearly panicked. That's when an unexpected voice broke the silence. "Dad, what's going on?" A young waitress, whom I hadn't noticed before, approached Frank. Her eyes went from us to her father, full of confusion and shame. Frank swallowed. "Lisa, go back to the kitchen." But Lisa didn't move. Instead, she looked straight at me and said, "Sir, I'm sorry about what happened to you. This isn't right." At that moment, I realized that we had achieved something more powerful than any confrontation. We had planted a seed of change. What happened next would change not only Joe's Diner, but our entire community. The silence in the restaurant was palpable. All eyes were on Lisa, the young waitress who had just defied her own father. Frank, the manager, seemed to be fighting an internal battle. I decided to seize the moment. "Frank," I said, keeping my voice calm and firm, "we didn't come here to cause trouble. We came because we believe that every American deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of the color of their skin." I paused, letting my words sink in. Then I continued. "All of us here serve our country. We fought side by side, bled together, lost friends together. We didn't care about the skin color of the soldier next to us when we were on the battlefield. Why should it matter here?" I saw something change in Frank's eyes. It was as if a curtain was being lifted, revealing a long-hidden truth. Lisa stepped forward. "Dad," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "you always taught me to treat everyone with respect. What we're doing here, isn't that?" Frank looked at his daughter, then at us, and finally at the rest of the restaurant. The other customers watched in silence, many with expressions of shame and regret. Then, to my surprise, Frank did something unexpected. He took off his apron, put it on the counter and said, "I'm ashamed, not just for what happened today, but for all the times I've turned a blind eye to injustice. I apologize." He turned to me and held out his hand. "Sir, I'd like to offer you and your friends a meal on the house. Not as compensation, because I know there isn't enough compensation for what you've been through, but as a first step towards change." I hesitated for a moment, then shook his hand. "Change begins with a single act of courage," I said. "I accept your apology, Frank, but more importantly, I accept your commitment to do better." What followed was a scene I'll never forget. The customers started applauding. Some stood up and came over to shake our hands, thanking us for our service. Lisa started handing out menus to all of us, with tears in her eyes but a smile on her face. As we sat down to eat, I realized that we had achieved something greater than just changing a restaurant's policy. We had touched hearts and minds. We had started a conversation that was long overdue in our community. But the story didn't end there. What happened in the following days and weeks would surprise us all. In the days following the incident at Joe's Diner, something extraordinary began to happen in our small Texas town. The news spread like wildfire through dry straw, first through word of mouth, then through local social networks. A video that a customer had discreetly recorded in the restaurant went viral. Suddenly, our story was no longer just local, it had gone national. The following Tuesday, I received an unexpected call. It was from a producer at a major news channel. "Mr. Johnson," said the voice on the other end of the line, "we'd like to invite you to share your story on our national program." I was hesitant at first. I didn't want this to become a media circus. But then I thought, this could be an opportunity to take our message to a wider audience. I accepted the invitation on one condition: that Frank and Lisa were also invited. To my surprise, they agreed. On the day of the interview, we sat side by side, me, Frank, and Lisa. The presenter asked us about the incident, about our emotions, about what we had learned. Frank spoke with an honesty that surprised me. "I grew up with certain prejudices," he admitted. "I never really questioned them. But seeing all those veterans together, hearing their stories, it made me realize how wrong I was. Lisa added, "This experience has changed the way I see the world. I realized that it's not enough not to be racist. We have to be actively anti-racist." When it was my turn to speak, I looked directly into the camera. What happened at Joe's Diner is not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a bigger problem in our society. But it also showed that change is possible when we stand together and face prejudice with courage and compassion. The interview had an impact that none of us could have predicted. In the weeks that followed, we received messages from all over the country. Veterans shared their own stories of discrimination. Business owners contacted us, wanting to know how they could make their establishments more inclusive. But the most surprising thing was what happened in our own city. The mayor invited us to a meeting where he proposed the creation of a racial equality committee. Frank offered to lead an anti-racism training program for local businesses. I realized that our small act of courage had sparked something much bigger. We had started a conversation that had long needed to happen. As I watched these changes unfold, I couldn't help but think, sometimes you have to face the darkness to bring the light. And sometimes, change starts with a simple request for a meal. In the weeks following the national interview, our small Texas town became an epicenter of change. What began as an isolated incident at Joe's Diner had become a catalyst for a wider community transformation. The mayor, making good on his promise, established the Committee on Racial Equality, and I was honored with the invitation to be one of the founding members. Our first meeting was held in the town hall, and I was impressed by the diversity of the participants. There were representatives of all ethnicities, ages, and socioeconomic backgrounds. During that meeting, an idea emerged that captured everyone's imagination: a multicultural festival to celebrate the diversity of our city. The suggestion came from Elena, a young university student who had returned to the city after the incident at Joe's Diner. "What if we turn this into something positive?" she proposed. "An event that showcases the best of all the cultures that make up our community." The idea was met with enthusiasm, and soon we were all working together to make it a reality. Frank, surprisingly, offered to coordinate the culinary part of the festival, promising to bring in chefs from different ethnic backgrounds. As preparations for the festival progressed, I noticed other subtle but significant changes taking place in the city. Stores started displaying "Everyone is welcome here" signs in their windows. The local library started a reading series focusing on authors from diverse backgrounds. Even the local school revised its curriculum to include a more diverse perspective on American history. However, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There was resistance from some of the more conservative sectors of the city. I received some hate mail and heard whispers of disapproval in the streets. But for every negative voice, there were dozens of supportive ones. One day, while walking through the park, I was approached by an elderly man I didn't know. "You're Marcus Johnson, aren't you?" he asked. When I confirmed it, he continued, "I want you to know that what you did, well, it made me rethink a lot of things. I'm 75 years old and I never thought I'd change the way I see the world at this point in my life. But you've proved to me that it's never too late to learn and grow." That simple moment moved me deeply. I realized that real change doesn't just happen through grand gestures or policies, but also through countless personal interactions and moments of reflection. As the day of the festival approached, I felt a mixture of anxiety and hope. Would we really be able to unite our community? What would happen when people from all backgrounds came together to celebrate their differences and similarities? The big day was coming, and with it, the promise of a new chapter in our city's history. Chapter 7. The Union Festival. The day of the festival finally arrived, bringing with it an electric energy that seemed to envelop the whole city. The Central Park, normally quiet on Saturdays, was now filled with colorful stalls, flags from different nations, and the tantalizing aroma of food from all over the world. I arrived early, eager to see everything take shape. Frank was already there, coordinating a diverse team of volunteer chefs. He waved to me with a smile, a simple gesture that symbolized how much things had changed. As the morning progressed, the park filled up. Families of all backgrounds arrived, many wearing the traditional costumes of their cultures. Children ran from one stall to another, their faces alight with excitement. On a makeshift stage, Groups took turns performing dances and songs from different parts of the world. I saw tears in an elderly man's eyes as a children's choir sang a song in Spanish. I later found out that it was the first time in 50 years that he had heard the music of his homeland in public in our city. In the food area, queues formed at every stall. I saw people trying dishes they had never tasted before, exchanging recipes and stories. Frank was in his element, introducing chefs to each other and encouraging everyone to try something new. But the most touching moment of the day came unexpectedly. In the middle of the afternoon, I noticed a group of young people gathering by the lake. They were carrying placards and, for a moment, I feared it was some kind of protest. But when I got closer, I saw that the placards said things like, "We are all human, and diversity makes us stronger." Lisa, Frank's daughter, was leading the group. When she saw me, she smiled and said, "Mr. Johnson, we want to thank you and all the veterans. You have shown us what it means to fight for justice. Now it's our turn to continue that fight." At that moment, I felt a wave of emotion hit me. I realized that what we had started was bigger than any of us. It was the beginning of a generational change. As the sun set, illuminating the sky in shades of orange and pink, people began to gather in the center of the park. Someone started singing, "We Shall Overcome," and soon hundreds of voices joined in, creating a powerful and moving harmony. Looking around, I saw faces of all colors, ages, and backgrounds, united in a moment of hope and solidarity. I thought back to my days in the army, to the battles I fought, and realized that this one, the battle for a fairer and more inclusive society, was perhaps the most important of all. The festival was over, but its impact would continue to reverberate for a long time. We had planted a seed of change, and now it was up to all of us to nurture it and watch it grow. As I walked home that evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. From a moment of discrimination in a small restaurant to a festival that united an entire community, I realized that real change is possible, even if it starts with a small act of courage. And I knew that our story was far from over. In fact, it was only the beginning. Chapter 8: The Legacy in the Making. In the months following the festival, our small Texas town continued to surprise us all with its capacity for change and growth. The event was not just a day of celebration, but the catalyst for lasting transformation in our community. One of the first notable changes took place in the local schools. Inspired by the festival, the principal of the high school, Mrs. Martinez, implemented a cultural ambassadors program. Students from different ethnic backgrounds were encouraged to share aspects of their cultures with their peers through presentations, cooking classes, and even mini-language lessons. The impact was immediate and profound. Bullying related to cultural differences decreased dramatically, and students began to show a genuine interest in learning about each other's backgrounds. In the business sector, Frank surprised everyone by transforming Joe's Diner into a multicultural restaurant. He hired chefs from diverse backgrounds and revamped the menu to include dishes from all over the world. The restaurant's new slogan was "Savor the Diversity," and it soon became the city's most popular place to dine. But the most significant change, in my opinion, came from an unexpected place. The chief of police, a man known for his hardline stance, came to me one day with a surprising proposal. "Marcus," he said, "I want you to lead a training program for our officers on cultural sensitivity, understanding implicit prejudices, how to better interact with diverse communities. You've served our country, and now I need you to serve our city that way." I was momentarily speechless. This was the same man who, just a few months earlier, had dismissed my concerns about racial discrimination as exaggeration. His change in attitude was a testament to the power of education and exposure to diversity. I accepted the proposal, of course, and soon we were working together to reshape police practices in our city. It wasn't easy. There was resistance from some older officers, but slowly, we saw a change in the way the police interacted with the community. A year after the Joe's Diner incident, our city was recognized at the state level as a model of integration and racial harmony. Journalists from all over the country came to cover our story of transformation. On one of those days, while giving an interview to a national newspaper, the reporter asked me, "Mr. Johnson, what would you say has been the most important factor in this extraordinary change in your community?" I thought for a moment before answering. "You know, Many people think that big changes require big actions. But what I've learned is that real change starts with small acts of courage. It starts when one person decides to stand up against injustice. It starts when someone chooses to listen and learn, rather than judge. It starts when a community decides it's time to do better. As he spoke, I saw a group of children walking down the street, a rainbow of skin colors, all laughing and playing together. And in that moment, I felt a deep sense of gratitude and hope. I knew we still had a long way to go, but I also knew we were heading in the right direction. Our journey was far from over, but each step took us closer to a future where everyone would be truly equal and respected. And that, I realized, was the true meaning of serving my country. As the second year after the incident at Joe's Diner approached, I realized that the waves of change we started in our small town were spreading beyond our borders. It all started with an unexpected email from a veteran in a neighboring town. He had heard about our story and wanted to know if I could help him implement similar changes in his community. Soon, we were exchanging ideas and strategies. That email was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, I was contacted by community leaders, activists, and even politicians from all over the state of Texas. Everyone wanted to know how they could replicate our success. I realized that we had a unique opportunity to expand our impact. With the help of Frank, Lisa, and other key members of our community, we began to develop a toolkit for social change. It included practical guides on how to organize multicultural events, implement sensitivity training in schools and businesses, and work with police forces to improve community relations. One day, I received a phone call that would change everything again. It was an aide to the governor of Texas. "Mr. Johnson," he said, "the governor has been impressed by the work you've done in his city. He would like to invite you to lead a state task force on racial equality and inclusion." I was momentarily speechless. This was an opportunity to take our message and methods to a much wider audience. But it also meant leaving my city for long periods of time. After consulting my family and friends, I decided to accept the invitation. However, I made sure that our local team was also included in the task force. After all, our strength has always been in our diversity and teamwork. Over the next few months, we traveled all over Texas, sharing our story and working with communities to implement change. We saw towns that were once divided by racial tensions begin to heal. We saw young people leading the way, organizing their own multicultural festivals and exchange programs. A particularly powerful moment occurred during a visit to a small town in East Texas, known for its history of segregation. After our presentation, an elderly man stood up. He identified himself as a former member of the Ku Klux Klan. "I've lived my whole life hating," he said, his voice shaking. "But hearing your stories today, for the first time, I wonder if maybe I was wrong all along." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, slowly, people began to stand up and applaud. Not just applauding us, but celebrating this man's courage to admit his mistake and his willingness to change. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how far we had come. From a painful incident in a small restaurant, we had sparked a movement that was transforming lives across the state. But I knew that our journey was far from over. There was still so much work to be done, so many minds to be opened, so many hearts to be touched. And as I looked out of the car window, watching the vast Texas plains go by, I felt a mixture of pride, humility, and determination. Pride in what we had achieved, humility at the magnitude of the challenge we still faced, and determination to keep fighting for a fairer and more equal future for all. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in a long time, I felt that we were truly on the right track. As our work with the state task force gained momentum, I realized that we were on the threshold of something truly transformative. It was no longer just about our small town or even Texas. We were creating a model that could be applied across the country. One day, I received a phone call that would change everything once again. It was from a United States senator. "Mr. Johnson," he said, "the work you are doing in Texas has not gone unnoticed in Washington. We'd like to invite you and your team to testify before a Senate Committee on Racial Equality and Police Reform." My heart raced. This was an opportunity to take our message to the national stage. But it was also a huge responsibility. In the weeks that followed, we worked tirelessly preparing our testimony. We wanted to ensure that we weren't just telling our story, but offering practical and applicable solutions on a national scale. The day of the hearing arrived. As I sat in front of the Senate committee, I looked at my team, Frank, Lisa, Elena, the police chief, and others who had joined our cause along the way. We were a diverse group, united by a common purpose. I began my testimony by telling the story of the incident at Joe's Diner. I talked about how that moment of discrimination became a catalyst for change. I shared the successes we've had and the challenges we've faced. Ladies and gentlemen, I concluded, what we've learned is that real change doesn't come from the top down. It starts in communities, with ordinary people taking a stand against injustice. What we need from the government is not just laws, but support for local initiatives, funding for educational programs, and a genuine commitment to equality at all levels. The impact of our testimony was immediate. In the following weeks, we saw an increase in national interest in our model. Cities across the country began implementing programs similar to ours. But the most surprising moment came a few weeks after the hearing. I got a call from the White House. The president wanted to meet me. In the Oval Office, the president thanked me for our work and then asked a question that took me by surprise. Mr. Johnson, we are considering creating a new cabinet position, a Secretary of Racial Equity and Inclusion. We would like you to consider taking on this position. I was momentarily speechless. It was an incredible honor, but also a daunting responsibility. Mr. President, I replied after a moment, I am honored by the invitation. But before I accept, I need to ask a question. Will this position have the real power to affect change? Because I can't just be a symbol. I need to know that I can make a difference. The president smiled. That's exactly why we want you, Mr. Johnson. We don't want someone who just takes a job. We want someone who's going to fight for real change. As I left the White House that day, my mind whirled with possibilities. We had come a long way since that day at Joe's Diner. And now, we had the opportunity to take our fight for equality and justice to the highest level of government. The road ahead would be challenging, I knew. But looking back at everything we had achieved, I felt a surge of hope and determination. Our journey was far from over. In fact, in many ways, it had only just begun. But for the first time, I felt that we had the power to really change the world. And that, I realized, was the true meaning of serving my country. Taking over as Secretary of Racial Equality and Inclusion was quite a transition. From discriminated against veteran to small-town leader, and now presidential cabinet member, the journey seemed almost surreal. My first months in Washington were a roller coaster. I faced resistance from politicians who saw my appointment as a political move, and skepticism from activists who feared I would be co-opted by the system. But I stayed true to the principles that had brought me there. My first initiative was to launch a national program inspired by what we had done in our Texan city. We called it Project Unity, a comprehensive plan to promote racial equality and inclusion at all levels of American society. The project included 1. Police reform. Implementation of mandatory training on implicit bias and community relations for all police forces in the country. 2. Education. A new school curriculum that honestly addressed America's racial history and celebrated diversity. 3. Economy. Incentives for companies that promoted diversity in leadership positions and initiatives to support minority entrepreneurs. 4. Health. Programs to address racial disparities in access to health care. 5. Culture. Funding for multicultural festivals and exchange programs in communities across the country. It wasn't easy. We faced fierce opposition from certain political and media sectors. I was accused of promoting reverse racism and of trying to rewrite American history. But for every voice of opposition, there were dozens of voices of support. Communities across the country began to adopt aspects of the Unity Project. We saw historically divided cities begin to heal. Schools reported a decrease in racial bullying. Companies that adopted our diversity guidelines saw increases in productivity and innovation. One of the most powerful moments came during a visit to a small town in Mississippi known for its history of segregation. After implementing Project Unity for 6 months, the mayor, a 60-year-old white man, hugged me with tears in his eyes. "Mr. Secretary," he said, "I grew up believing that segregation was the natural way of things. But to see our community come together like this, well, it changed everything for me. Thank you for showing us a better way. As I drove back to Washington that evening, I reflected on how far we had come and how much more we still had to do. Real change, I realized, doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow, sometimes painful process, but it's always worth it. And as I looked out of the plane window, seeing the lights of the cities below, I felt a mixture of pride, humility, and determination. Pride in what we had achieved, humility at the magnitude of the challenge we still faced, and determination to keep fighting for a fairer and more equal future for all Americans. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, I felt that we were truly on the right path towards a more united and equal America. 5 years have passed since I took over as Secretary for Racial Equality and Inclusion. 5 years of struggles, victories, defeats, and, above all, continuous learning. Project Unity had taken root in communities across the country, but we faced new challenges every day. One of these challenges came unexpectedly. A series of terrorist attacks in several American cities threatened to unleash a wave of xenophobia and Islamophobia. Suddenly, all the progress we had made seemed to be at risk. At this critical moment, I brought together my team and community leaders from across the country. This is the true test of our work, I said. It's not just about how we react when things are calm, but how we unite in the face of adversity. We launched a national campaign called We Are All Americans. It highlighted the stories of Muslim Americans who were teachers, doctors, police officers, firefighters, ordinary people who contributed to their communities every day. The campaign had a powerful impact. In cities across the country, we saw neighbors coming together to protect mosques and Islamic cultural centers. Students organized interfaith vigils. Leaders from different communities spoke out in solidarity. It was during this period that I received a phone call that I will never forget. It was from Ahmed, a young American Muslim from Minnesota. "Mr. Secretary," he said, his voice breaking, "I wanted to thank you. After the attacks, I was afraid to leave my house. But to see how my community has come together, to see people from all backgrounds defending us, it gave me hope again. It made me feel that I really belong in this country." His words moved me deeply. I realized that our work wasn't just about policies or programs. It was about changing hearts and minds, about creating a genuine sense of community and belonging for all Americans. As my term as secretary drew to a close, I reflected on all that we had accomplished and the challenges that still lay ahead. I knew that the fight for equality and inclusion was an ongoing job that would require constant vigilance and dedication. In my farewell speech, I looked at the room full of diverse faces, people of all races, religions, and backgrounds, united by a common purpose. When I started this journey, I said, I was just a veteran facing discrimination in a small restaurant in Texas. Today, I stand before you as someone who has had the privilege of serving our country in a new way. But the real change didn't come from me or from Washington. It came from you, from the communities that came together.